God, we're so grateful for this time together. We thank you for those that have found their way to be with us in this moment. We thank you for those that will come later, look at the video after it's posted on YouTube and Facebook and elsewhere online. God, I pray that in this moment, whether it's now or later, that you will speak to our hearts, give us what you would want us to know, teach us what you would have us to learn, provoke us to do what you would have us to do, and become all that you want us to be. We say yes to you. And we know that with you, we can do anything because you are God and above you there.
Bible class.
We bless your name for all of that, and we thank you, and we ask all of this in the name of your beloved Son. Amen.
Amen.
Amen. All right, we're going to, if you're coming on, unless you're going to speak, mute so that we get so we don't get a lot of background noise, okay? But we should be all right, I think. And off we go. Sunday morning, so this coming Sunday, oh my goodness, this coming Sunday morning is just like all the traffic will allow, to borrow from that old "And There's No Business Like Show Business" song. This is like all the traffic will allow on Sunday. So Pilgrimites, there's a wonderful service at 10 a.m. As always, you guys are I just love breezing through. Some Sundays I can't even stay because I've got to be somewhere else, but I come through at least and check on y'all. So Sunday morning at 10 a.m. online at pilgrimoakpark.org, Sundays online. You can also look them up on YouTube, and because that's where they come out of. So that's there. If you don't want to be there, you could go a little farther west, because I'm the guest preacher at the online service for First Congregational on this coming Sunday at the same time. Or you can go to Pilgrim and then go find me later, or vice versa, because these services, you don't have to be in real time for these. But I'm preaching there, and I just put in a little bit of me kind of in my Sunday best from the videotape. The sermon is about Zacchaeus, and it's called Coming Out in the House of Shame. And if you just need a little more preaching, you can get it at loveandjustice.org is their website, and you can definitely find us there. Then big stuff at 5 o'clock, and I expect to see you all at 5 o'clock on Sunday for In the Name of Love, our Pride service. Just before just before we got on, Russell sent me the mix of the audio for the, I still haven't found what I'm looking for. It's gorgeous. The video's all starting to come in. I am so excited. If I could, I would do that service right now. But I need to edit and put it, I have a lot to do. I still have to record the message, but make sure that there's that. And you find that on the Gather Austin Oak Park YouTube page. I'll send an email with the link out up for that directly after I upload the page. I can't do that until I upload the page. So once I'll get the video uploaded, look in your email and you'll have a link directly for that service. It's beautiful. Everything that's coming together for that is just exquisite and wonderful. Following that, though, Rachel Pierce, who, as a lot of you know from Gather, she is actually been working for 2 years on this magnificent documentary about queer women of color in Chicago. And her movie premieres at 6 p.m. So right after Gather, I promised her that I would flip right over to this, but that is at pridestudio.live. And if you want to see that, some of the work that I've seen, that pieces of it, it's beautiful. She has found so many wonderful, wise women to tell about their experiences growing up in and being Black and queer in a time when neither was really easy in the city. And so it's a beautiful piece, and you want to make sure that you see that. Next week, let's take a walk. I've been marching for the last 3 or 4 weeks. I've been in the streets with everybody else, and I'm missing you all. So if you'd like to take a walk, shoot me an email or text me, and we'll find some time next week. I'll stack up a few in Oak Park and come out and march with all the Oak Parkers. Chris, I don't think I can get to Scotland to walk with you, but anybody that's in and North Shea, unfortunately, can't get to North Carolina, but those that I can see and get to, we can certainly spend some time walking and visiting together. If it's not a walk, we can certainly sit together outside and have a chat. So I'm looking forward to that. Look at you all. Everybody's coming in. It's just beautiful to see you. And we're going to, hi, Jane. Hi, Bill. Hi, Karen. Everybody's coming in. There's Josephine and Mary. Look at this. Oh, it's always like a family reunion. I always get excited. So it's good to see you all. And now let's kind of look at where we're going and what our lesson is leading us into. So this week we are going to spend, let me see, we got to mute somebody, I think. Hang on. Okay. This week we're going to be spending some time looking at humanity, but I always want to take us back to the beginning. This whole series of origins is designed for us to reach up in the orange trees after we've shaken the snakes out. So we're always shaking the snakes out of the trees to get to the rich oranges. And that's the whole idea. This is what liberation looks like. It's good and it's juicy and it's fruity and sweet and delicious, but you can't get to it unless first you go back to the tree, shake the tree, make sure you get all the snakes out. And so that's kind of what this whole purpose is to do, for us to think about some of these ideas that we've been hearing and thinking about for a long, long time, but may not have really shaken all the snakes out. And one of the things that we don't talk a lot about is ourselves and where we fit and what all of this means. And so today's topics really are, today's topic is really focused on our humanity and understanding who we are. So that's where we are. And we're going to begin, well, I went the wrong way. Okay. With just a general question, because a lot of us, and I think I've muted everyone. So if you need to speak, you'll need to unmute yourselves, okay? But this question is kind of an important question, because a lot of people go through life and never really get to any self-understanding at all. Have you ever known anybody like that? They just kind of wander through life willy-nilly, haven't really thought about who they are, about what their place in the world is, why they believe what they believe, how what they believe sort of impacts or affects the way that they shape their morals and the way they shape their self-understanding and the way they shape who they are and all of those kinds of things. That's really, really important. And so what we wind up is we never really wonder where our self-understanding comes from. And of course, part of it we can say is cultural, but because it's cultural, it's also tied to our faith and our faith tradition and all of those kinds of things. And so where does our self-understanding come from? If we are Christians, it comes from very particular stories and sort of the myths that we've been taught. And I don't mean myth as in not true, I mean myth as in true without having to be factual, the narratives that we've been given. And we come to this with an idea because when we're very young, we're told this is where you come from, and this is sort of the way that it works. And we all know where it begins. It begins right in the first chapter of Genesis, doesn't it? God said, let us make humanity in our image to resemble us. I love that God's plural in this. God is already inclusive in Genesis 1. To resemble us so that they may take charge of the fish of the sea and the birds in the sky and the livestock, so all the earth and all the crawling things. And God created humanity in God's own image. In the divine image, God created them. Male and female, God created them. We all know that. We've all heard that. That's the story that we're told. We are made by God in God's own image. The second story of our creation comes up immediately beginning in chapter 2, verse 4 or 5, somewhere in there. And this is where a singular God picks dirt up out of the earth and shapes us, blows breath into us, and we become living beings. We know that story too, right? I want to make something to point out. If we were in my queer theology study, I would be pointing out that male and female, God created them. For a long, long time, the ancient rabbis understood that text to mean that the first human beings were not male or female, but they were male and female. And that the division doesn't happen until later on. And so that's an interesting thing for folks that right away we understand now that Scripture puts us in trouble for those that want to read it literally. Because if you read this literally, it would mean that every human being was male and female.
You just blew my mind.
Did I just blow your mind, Brian?
Yes, you did. No, that's an extraordinary insight.
Right. Yeah. That male, and so that's why when people start saying, oh, God made made men and women to be this and that. It's like, wait a minute. The ancient rabbis, the rabbis of Jesus's day, in fact, understood this text to believe male, God created people to be hermaphroditic, if you will, or dually sexed.
Right, because as I read this or heard you reading this, I'm thinking, oh, that's leaving out everyone else who
Right.
is male or female,
Mm-hmm.
and immediately dismissing it as, well, that
Binary.
doesn't reflect the modern world.
Yeah.
And what you just said tells me that there was already an understanding that maybe incredibly sort of predated the modern world.
Mm-hmm. If you go back to Plato's story, do you all know Plato's story about the way the genders are born? It's the same idea that the first human beings were dually sexed and then they get split apart. In fact, in Jesus's day, the rabbis had 6 genders, not 2. And I could rattle them off for you. There is the heterosexual male, the procreative male, the procreative female, the non-procreative male, and the non-procreative female. And then a wonderful character called the tum-tum, which is an interesting, I love the tum-tum. The tum-tum is a person who dresses and bears the affectations of the other gender, but still is sexually attracted to the opposite sex. And then there is the hermaphrodite, who is both gendered, dually gendered. And so there are all these genders that were understood in Jesus's day and in ancient cultures that we got rid of. We just simplified because that's a whole lot of boxes to check, right? That's just bad for bureaucracy. So we just kind of went down to 2.
I don't want to take you too far off track, but it reminds me of one of the early songs in Hedwig and the Angry Inch.
Exactly.
Where, which is
the story of love, right?
A lyrical explanation of the ancient Greek understanding of, the creation of gender.
Yep.
And
it's the same thing. Yeah. Yeah, it is this idea of two. Yeah. It's wonderful.
Well, if God made humans in God's image, male and female, then Jesus must have been that way.
It could be. It could be. Because of Jesus is God. So it's just this idea that we already as human beings, we get very, very limited, right? We want to make categories very firm and hard. And all of a sudden, it's like the ancients were like, I don't know. Well, maybe we need to think about this in a little more creatively. And that's really going to be the challenge to us all tonight. Now, then, so we get ourselves made, and then what's the next chapter in the story? Here comes the snake, right? And we get this famous passage. Did God really say that you shouldn't eat from any tree in the garden? And Eve says, well, we may eat from the fruit of the garden, but not the fruit of the tree in the middle of the garden. This tree has knowledge in it, right, of good and evil. Don't eat from it and don't touch it or you will die, God said. And the snake said, you won't die. God knows that on the day you eat from it, you'll see clearly and you'll be like God, knowing good and evil. And all of a sudden in the narrative, because prior to this, in all truth, we've been created and God's doing all the work and we're just sitting there just enjoying ourselves. And all of a sudden what enters the story is the question of choice and decision and figuring out what needs to happen for ourselves and how we relate to this place that we've been put in, to one another, to God, to what God desires from us. And all of a sudden now we are in a situation where this beautiful garden, we start making choices, and what happens to the beautiful garden? Boom, there it goes. I don't know if you guys have ever seen this famous print, this Dürer print of the it like being cast out of the garden. This was in one of the Bible books I grew up with, and I used to just stare at it and be terrified. So this was like, well, so much for God, right? Look at this. How horrible this is. And as I look at this and I think about this, I start to think, well, this is right away, it's sort of how God gets a bad rap, right? If you think about it, this is like, okay, just look at this. God sets up this beautiful garden. He makes these beautiful creatures. He gives them all of this wonderful stuff. And then he places a rule that's designed to just mess the whole thing up. And that's got to be kind of where you look and say, like, maybe not so much, what kind of friend is this? It would be like, have you ever had a friend that made a grand promise to you and then said, never mind, you know what, you upset me, we're not going to do this anymore. That's kind of the feel that we get for it. When I'm teaching grace in other settings, and I really toyed with whether or not I wanted to do this, and I said, okay, I'm going to do this. When I'm teaching what grace looks like, I go back to my college days. Some of you that might be my age might remember this. When I was in college, first of all, I was a film major at Northwestern, and so one of my jobs as being on the film board and everything was I was a projectionist, back when you had to thread projectors and stuff, right? And so you always had to show these openings. You had to, like, there always had to be a cartoon and a preview and a this and a that before you got to the feature. And there was a short film that we loved at Northwestern. We looked at it over and over and over. People couldn't get enough of it. And I'm going to show it to you because in many ways it's sort of, I went the wrong way, didn't I? Okay, there you go. My little mouse is very sensitive. In many ways, this film kind of captures the story we tell about our early relationship with God and kind of the way that it goes. And I'll just watch it. It's an edited version of a very short film, but here we go. I don't know. Let me see if I shared the audio or not. It doesn't really need the audio. It's just little soft Sylvan music if you can't hear it. The end. That to me summarizes exactly what happens in this garden story, right? There's Bambi, it's all sylvan and beautiful. And all of a sudden that, and we mess up. And according to the way that so many people read that story, what happens? Boom, the foot comes down, game over, get out of the garden. We're not friends anymore. You know what? You're in all kinds of trouble. It's downhill from here.
That's me meeting life.
But there's another way to see this. Hang on, I got to get out of this. The other way to think about it would be this way. Grace is the reverse of that. Do you see what I mean? Grace is where all the burdens that we bear get lifted. Grace is where we become into the fullness of our own, where the choices we make create room and space for us to find out who we are and to live in unity with God. The great theologian, one of my buddies in thought, Paul Tillich, puts it this way. And it's this kind of a little bit of a brain buster kind of. He says, the possibility of the fall depends on the qualities of human freedom. Now, I'm going to explain all this in a second. If the human had not received the possibility of freedom, we would have been a thing among things, unable to serve the divine glory, either in salvation or in condemnation. Now, before you let all that language work you out, I'll just apologize for Paul Tillich. He was a German theologian who wound up teaching at University of Chicago, so he's got to talk this way. But let's kind of reach in to see what he's saying. He's saying that without freedom, we could have never made the choices that we make in the story of the fall from grace. And if we did not have freedom, none of this would have any meaning, because without freedom, we would have been just a thing among things. We would have been no different than anyone else. we would never, our service to God, our worship, none of this would have had any meaning. Whether we went well, did a good thing and were saved, or whether or not we did things that would bring us under condemnation. Freedom is the linchpin to faith. It is the linchpin to being who you are as a human being. It is the linchpin to your self-understanding. If you don't understand that you have been endowed with freedom, then it's impossible for you to grasp who you are and how important you are, both to God and to the world that you live in. Because everything we do comes out of freedom. It comes out of freedom. And that's why the greatest crimes, that the things that horrify us most, are when people's lives and freedom are taken from them, right? Because what you're doing is, what do we say that is? It's dehumanizing for that to happen. And so freedom is the basis of humanity. And when you're thinking about being human, when we say, oh, I'm only human, that's usually like, oh, well, I make mistakes. I don't know what I'm doing. I'm not sure what's going on here. But I'm human. My goodness. I'm only human means that I am free, that my choices have an impact on my life, on the lives around me, on the world I live in. And those choices, as much as they can be made, well, I'm sorry, I keep messing up here. I need to leave this alone. Are based on my freedom.
We're only human.
We're only human, which means that we are free. Because without freedom to question, without freedom to create, without freedom to love, nothing, and we could make the list going on. These are the 3 areas we're going to focus on tonight. Nothing that we do has any meaning. If I said, let's take, like we just had Father's Day. What if we made it a law that on Father's Day you had to call your father? What would that mean if I got my call on Father's Day? I'm blessed. Walter and I don't have any children, but we have a lot of children. We have a lot of young folks that we've helped in the world. And it's really beautiful on Father's Day. We get texts and emails and calls and stuff, But what if you had a law that you had to call your father on Father's Day? How meaningful would that call be? Not much. It's out of the calls that come out of freedom would make a difference. You chose to pick up the phone. What if we had laws that said you had to go to church on Sunday? So going to church would have no meaning. I'm here because the law says it. It might mean something to you personally, but overall, if you don't have a choice, if you're not coming to worship out of freedom, it doesn't have meaning. And so,
we grew up with that.
Yeah, yeah. A lot of folks grew up with, I got no choice. I got to go to church, right? I didn't get a lot of choice either.
That was a rule of the church.
The church said you got to go, right?
Catholic Church.
Yeah. My parents had the rule, but they were sort of effectively the church because they were the pastors too. And we were Pentecostal. So we went Sunday morning and Sunday night and Wednesday night and Friday night. We were church 4 times a week. And in between, we couldn't stop praying and carrying on. It was just crazy town. So in many ways, I felt like I was in bondage in church because I didn't have a choice. But what you all see where I'm headed, right? That freedom. Yes.
So Adam and Eve were not free until they committed the original sin.
They had freedom from the beginning. God gives them a choice.
But they didn't have so they did have the freedom to question.
Sure they did. That's where it comes from, right? And what I love is there are 2 trees in the garden. There's the knowledge of good and evil, and then there's the tree of life. And I always wonder, why didn't they go eat from the tree of life? They wanted the knowledge of good and evil. So they had freedom to question. And what I'm saying is that even though this myth sets it up and we interpret this myth to mean, oh, you should never question, you should do everything you're told, they were exercising the freedom that God gave them. What Tillich is saying is that if they didn't exercise that freedom, then the whole story would have no meaning. And our lives would have no meaning. Because everything that we do as people of God, as citizens, as family members, is somehow or other has to come out of our freedom to choose to do this or to do something else. If we are compelled, that's why it's like that's you know, I get nervous whenever I see laws that compel us to do things, as opposed to laws that help us, that make us free and give us rights to do things. And so that's the challenge that we have as human beings. But if we look more at the way this whole thing works, our freedom does not mean irresponsibility, because choices still have to be responsibly made. You ever known anybody that was so free that they're just, it's chaos wherever they go? There's so much freedom. It's like, oh my gosh, we need a little less freedom, a little more responsibility right through here. I have, you know, I'm blessed to have a lot of hang on, I'm trying to I'm blessed to have a lot of friends who are very, very free. And then I say to them, but what about this? Have you thought about that? Oh, I'm not worried about it. You know, struggling with freedom and what is responsible, and responsible to whom, are being responsible to ourselves, being responsible to one another, being responsible to God, being responsible to the worlds we live in, communities we live in. These are all questions that come into play. The thing about freedom that's so essential to remember, though, is if our goal is to move to a space where we are living in liberated lives and as free people, we have to make sure that we are balancing our exercise of freedom with our exercise of responsibility. I think that the lesson that we can learn from this is that freedom is not something to be taken lightly, but it is always something that we have to understand has to be paired in one way or another, you know, in terms of how we treat ourselves and the freedoms that we take, and knowing that we're being responsible. Because when you take freedom, and you take freedom, but you remove responsibility from it, you get something that's kind of very idealistic, right? This is free, I'm free, and that's a challenge. On the other hand, if you are all about responsibility and you remove freedom from the equation, then you get something that's very close to legalism, a bunch of rules and a bunch of ways and all of a sudden now you are obeying a bunch of rules and meeting other people's expectations without knowing exactly who you are. Have you ever known somebody, whether religiously or the person at work, who shows up right on time and does everything and gets all the work done on time, and at 5 o'clock, in the old days, they would be putting the cover over the typewriter and out the door, and off they go, and for their life is all very do, and you just look at the, you know, it's like, you know, yeah, it's like, Sally Mae, honey, you're gonna have to let your hair down sometime. You just need to be free for a minute, because there are people that become so rigid in being responsible that they lose touch with their freedom. And so there's always this tension between these two. And that's why we hear Paul remind the church in Galatians that it's for freedom, not for responsibility, for freedom that Christ has set us free. And then Paul says to them, look, stand firm. You're free, but don't just fly off. Stand firm, therefore, and do not submit again to a yoke of slavery. Now, what's interesting about this text is Paul's writing not to one church in Galatians. He's writing to churches all over Asia Minor. And a lot of these churches are heavily populated with slaves. The early church movement was very interesting in that it was a class-free movement. And so you would have dignitaries come, and you would also have slaves come, and they all worshiped and worked together. And so slavery was very real there. This was not a metaphor. In many ways, for a lot of people, this was their reality. And so Paul is saying, look, if that's the harsh reality of your lived life, in your faith life, in your spiritual life, you should not become enslaved. Now, he uses the word yoke, which is a very interesting idea, because the idea of the yoke is this idea that you are paired to someone else. You're going down when two oxen are yoked together, when one oxen turns, the other one has to turn. And so what Paul is saying is, like, do not let a slave mentality become the thing that you're affixed to, because it will lead you and you will have no choice to go. Jesus, in the meanwhile, comes, and he's always about freedom. We've used this text. I will quote this text more times than you can ever imagine. This is where Jesus clarifies his mission. He says, the Spirit is upon me God has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim what? Release to the captives, freedom and recovery of sight to the blind, good news to the poor, a liberating news, freedom, liberation for the captives, recovery of sight to the blind, liberation from those that are blind, and to let the oppressed go free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. That year of the Lord's favor is really important because that is the year when all debts are forgiven. So you're free from debt even. Jesus says, this is what my purpose is. And then he goes on in John and he says, if you continue in my word and you're truly my disciples, we all know this because people quote it all the time. You will know the truth and the truth will set you free. In the email for tonight's study I sent out, I quoted David Foster Wallace, who said, and I love this, the truth will set you free, but not until it's through with you. Because there is something about encountering the truth and being free in the truth that sometimes it's hard work being in this kind of place.
David Foster Wallace's observation is analogous to something that I heard a while back, which I think is really a deep set truth. And that is life may be, you may be done with life, but life is not done with you.
That's right.
And so your, freedom comes with obligations.
Right.
And our obligation is to live our lives.
Yes, you're right. And that's what will set us free if we recognize that this is what's in front of us, right? I want to make what happens to a lot of us, though, is we begin to take on these mindsets. Paulo Freire, who was a brilliant Harvard-trained educator who worked in Brazil, he was working with a lot of people who were living in poverty in Brazil and were living under a tremendous amount of oppression. And he came away with this idea that the oppressor is housed in the oppressed. That we take these ideas that cause us to believe that we are less than, that we cannot be, that we are not free, that we can never be free, that our conditions prevent us from ever experiencing freedom, and we internalize them so much to the point that they become the very source of our own oppression. James Baldwin put it like this: people are trapped in history, and history is trapped in them. I put up the picture of the Donald Glover video, This Is America, because that's all that video is about, is getting out from under the heel of history. And a lot of us know this idea of being sort of trapped in a mindset that is not free, a mindset of oppression and of struggle as Stockholm Syndrome. Y'all remember the story of Stockholm Syndrome? About the folks that were in a bank when it got robbed, and they were trapped so long with the guy that was holding them hostage that they all fell in love with him. And whenever they arrested him and it came time to testify, nobody would testify against this criminal that had endangered their lives. In fact, they raised the money for his defense. When you get so used to being, like in Mary's case, as she talked about, being forced to go to church every Sunday, a lot of people just fall in love with going to church, even though it's not coming out of their freedom. A lot of folks are in relationships that are not liberating at all, but they have fallen in love with what's holding them captive. And so a lot of us are in love, a lot of us white folks are in love with the story that we've been taught about how America came to be, to the point that we don't realize that we are being held hostage by a narrative that is absolutely not only immoral and unjust, it's just hateful. And yet we still get upset, well, we know at least one person in America is upset with statues coming down. We get up because why? You're messing with the story that I love, even though the story that I love is oppressive. So in understanding our freedom, it's not just about saying, oh, I'm free. It's also in our responsibility recognizing what forces are trying to remove and withhold freedom from us so that we can resist them. So what do we get to? That brings us to the first freedom I really want to talk about, which is this idea of the freedom to question. I could ask for a show of hands. How many of you grew up in a faith environment that said, this is what the Bible says, or this is what the church says, or this is what you've been taught? Don't question it. Don't question it. Just do it. A lot of us grew up in those environments. Just, you know what? That's what the preacher says. That's what the priest says. That's what the Bible says. I grew up with that's what the Bible said. Everybody knew what the Bible said. Everybody had a pipeline to the truth, right? And
That is wrong. The Bible tells me so, right?
Exactly. The Bible, the Bible, the Bible, the Bible. But what happens is if we lose our freedom to question, we lose our curiosity, and then we lose our souls. Aquinas, bless his heart, he was all over this 1,000 years ago. He talked about what he called the trifold soul. There are three ways of us to be in touch with ourselves. He talked about first the sensitive soul, which is the five senses, the way that we understand, taste, touch, smell, sight and hearing. But then he said there are also sensibilities that we have inside us. We know sorrow. We are sensitive to sorrow. We are all sensitive to joy. There's an internal sensitivity and a sensibility, and an external, or a five senses kind of, a sensory sensibility. Then he said there's the intellectual soul, the soul that reasons and rationalizes and wrestles with ideas. And then there is what he called the nutritive soul, the soul that is responsible for our well-being. The soul that says, you know what, maybe that 2 glasses of wine is enough for tonight, because tomorrow is not going to be fun for you. It is the soul that says you better eat something. It's the soul that says you need to get some fresh air. The soul that takes care of your nourishment and your well-being. And Aquinas says these three different souls merge into the fullness of ourselves. But in all of them, Aquinas keeps pointing to curiosity, that our curiosity is our soul work. The things we wonder about. What does that smell like? Walking down, I was out in Oak Park, about a week ago, in visiting John Reese's garden. He's got this beautiful garden, and there were these beautiful flowers, and I just leaned in right away to smell it, because I'm curious. What does that smell like? This curiosity goes from the five senses into our intellectual. What does this mean? How do I rationalize this? How do I understand this better? And the nutritive, how do I nourish myself? And when curiosity becomes soul work. Now, Paul Tillich, who I've already quoted once, he kind of builds on this idea of curiosity, and he casts it as doubt. And he says, don't think you've ever got any faith if you don't doubt. You ever heard folks that are so full of faith, I don't have any doubt at all? It's like, well, then you don't have faith, because faith automatically implies doubt. Faith means that I can't explain something. Faith means I'm not sure about this, but I'm believing it. And faith is what enables curiosity. Faith and doubt are what makes us try to figure things out. Faith also accepts the insecurities that we may not know. How wonderful, how liberating to say, you know what, I just don't know. Every now and then I get stuck on, I haven't been stuck on an airplane lately, but every now and then I get stuck on an airplane, and I'm sitting next to somebody, and it's, what do you do? What do you do? And I tell them what I do, and I always include the pastoral work, and this is part of my life. And then they want to talk about things, and then they just say, well, do you really believe that, heaven is up in the sky and that it's full of angels? And they want to go, and it's like, I don't know. I don't know. I know that Paul said nobody's seen or heard, or it can't even enter into our hearts what's on the other side. So I don't know. I just don't know. And it's like, you don't know? I thought you said you were a pastor. And it's like, yeah, I'm one of those kind of pastors. I just don't know a whole lot of stuff. But in the end of it, when we embrace doubt as part of our freedom, as part of being human, when we embrace that doubt, we find courage. On Saturday, I was on this webinar, which was the anti-racism work for white people, and I was sort of a dialogue partner with Reverend Connolly, who is Smash, is what we call her, and she was doing this brilliant job. And along the way, we were talking about how do you counteract people who make these racist comments, and I said, you just have to say, I don't believe it. And then somebody texted, well, what if they say, well, I don't believe blah, 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 blah. It's like, the answer is, I just don't believe what you're saying. I don't have to explain anything. I have my doubts about all of this. I don't believe it. And that's a courageous move. And some of us don't ever use that. Some of us think the answer to ignorance is to have the full explanation. Sometimes it's like, I don't know. I just don't know. But I know what you're saying is not right. So freedom to question is core to being human. It's core to who we are. And when we reject that, when we reject the willingness to question and our comfort with questioning, we lose touch with who we are as human beings. And when we don't know who we are as human beings, then we go back to, what does any of this mean? Then we have the freedom to create, to make meaning. I love whenever you get to graduate. I had this weird epiphany when I was in seminary, because you keep reading back. In seminary, you keep reading back. So you're going to read this, and then after you get this, then you're going to go to the 19th century, and then you're going to read, and then you're going to read Augustine. And after you read Augustine, you're going to keep reading back and going back and going back. And where does this idea come from? And it suddenly occurred to me that all this stuff that we were just banging our heads against, somebody made this up. Somebody made it up. And it was like, didn't fall out of the sky. Somebody made this up. They were making meaning. And somebody else said, this is how I make meaning. And this is, well, that's kind of interesting. I could live with that. So now you got two people that are shared meaning, and off it goes. So we have the freedom to create, to make meaning of our lives. Don't divorce yourself from that. What is your life about? You get to decide that. It's your freedom that enables you to decide who you are and what your life is about. It's also your freedom to frame your own worldview. Is this how you understand the world to work? I understand the world to work that people are kind. Even though every day I turn on the news, 7 a.m. in the morning, there's Gayle King, and the first minute and a half, your world in 90 seconds is usually me seeing people not being kind. But people are kind. That's my worldview. Those are the assumptions. I also have the freedom to shape my experience. How do I get to experience the world? How do I do that? I have the right to say, this is not healthy for me. This experience is not healthy for me, whether it's in relationship, whether it's in the habits that people are trying to encourage me to take on, whether it's in the food I eat, whatever it is, I shape my own experience. I'm free to create that. I'm also free to interpret the context of where I am. I am free to decide what's going on in this scene, whether this scene is at my dinner table or this scene is in the book of Samuel. It doesn't matter. I am free to interpret the context and to read what comes out of that. I'm also free to nurture my gifts and the gifts of others and the possibilities I hold and the possibilities of others. In other words, in all of this, I am free both to be and to become. Who I am is I am free to be that, and I get to be that, and I get to be all of it, even the parts that I don't like. I get to be that. But I'm also free to strive to become more, to become something different. Meister Eckhart, the great medieval mystic, put it this way: go into your own ground and learn to know yourself there. Go into your own ground and learn to know yourself. You've got plenty to work with there to create from. And Toni Morrison, at the right about the middle of the great book Beloved, her lead character, the runaway slave Setha, understands something that's really powerful. She understands that freeing yourself was one thing, but claiming ownership of that freed self was another. In the end of all of this, we have to own our freedom. We have to own the decisions we make, and we have to own the challenges that we accept and the way that we see the world. Any thoughts being triggered here? Am I just ranting? What's going on?
Tim, I have one.
Yes, Tom.
So, what you were saying before about, like freedom to like freedom getting true, and doing hard work for freedom.
Mm-hmm.
So in the original tale of Siddhartha, he saw three things that you can look up yourselves.
Mm-hmm.
And when he realized how fragile human life was, because he was originally a prince in South Asia,
Mm-hmm.
but then when he saw these three things, it just changed his life. And he's like, and then he decided to leave the palace on a white horse, and came to the foot of the mount of the Himalayas, and there he would have practiced asceticism, and he
Right.
would, and it was almost to the point, and it's got to the point where he was almost like skin and bone.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and there's this one tale my dad often once told me, that how Siddhartha was meditating and it began to rain, and how the king of the Naga, which are like these giant sort of snake-like beings,
Mm-hmm.
the king of these creatures came up and shielded him from the rain, keeping him dry.
Mm-hmm.
And
And so,
like,
yeah. So if I'm understanding what you're sort of taking us to, is this idea that the choices that Siddhartha makes, even though he's got all this wealth and everything, it leads to his freedom, right? And in that freedom, he's fully himself and protected. Am I getting it right?
yeah, but also not just his freedom, but he does this for the freedom of all beings. It's sort of more like more of a selfless act to be
Good.
resorted, you know.
Yeah.
It's pretty much a selfless act, because he's doing it to free all sentient beings from the sea of samsara, so to speak.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's powerful. That is powerful. And that kind of gets us to this next thing, because the next thing, Tone, that we're talking about is this idea of freedom to love. Yes? Did somebody else have something? No? I was just hearing a voice. Okay. Because then the last freedom that we get is freedom to love. And what's very interesting is the scripture often pairs the idea of freedom with love over and over and over again. And what's really interesting is, particularly at the time that these texts are being written, love is not what it is now. Now we have movies and novels about love. Back then, love was kind of like a nice to have, but it wasn't a have to have, because there was too much pressure in the world to just get to stay alive. And so in the middle of this, back to the Galatians, where Paul's writing to all these churches, he says, look, you were called to freedom, brothers and sisters. Only don't let this freedom be an opportunity to indulge your selfish impulses, but serve each other through love. So our freedom is not just for our own benefit. Our freedom is also so that when we are free, we are able to look around and extend ourselves. Have you ever been in situations where you're just feeling really free? And it's so much easier to do good stuff when you're feeling free as when you're feeling all boxed in. Have you ever had a good boss who just says, go be yourself, and all of a sudden you're just thriving, and there's anybody that needs your help, they get your help, and then you get the boss that's like, I'm watching you, I want you to know, and you better, and da-da-da-da-da-da-da, and all of a sudden it's just like, it turns all of the energy inward. I have to protect myself. When we embrace our freedom, love flows out of us, because we have all of this space around us to do these things. John put it this way, he said, there's no fear in love, but perfect love drives out fear, because fear expects punishment. The person who's afraid has not been made perfect in love. The person who is not free has not been made perfect in love. So if we look at this and kind of, what is our question? Are we free from things, or are we free to do things? We sort of get two sides of the same coin. And I'm using these terms, these are highly charged terms, and I'm using them kind of intentionally to kind of spark our attention. When we live lives of enslavement, when we live lives that do not embrace freedom, we are living in lives that are submissive, that are set by predefined limits. We don't control what the limits are. People are telling us, you can, you can't, you will, you won't, you should, you shouldn't, right? And our bodies also become commoditized. What do I mean by that? We're showing up and doing what we're told to do, and when we've done our job, just move on, take your body somewhere else. It does not matter. You don't have to be a literally bought slave to be enslaved, where you are just showing up and doing what you're supposed to do and leaving. And a lot of us take pride in that kind of stuff. There are a lot of us who have got a little Stockholm syndrome in some of these things. Yeah, I don't stick around. I don't impose myself on anybody. I just show up. I'm just the cog in the wheel. That's not what we're called to be. Our life then depends on the master, whatever that master may be. If it's a relationship, if it's a job, if it's a religion, all of a sudden we are defined by what is controlling us, and it leaves us powerless. On the other hand, if we are living lives that are liberated, instead of submitting, we feel free to challenge. Doesn't mean that we're running around shaking our fists at everything. It means, yeah, you know what, I can't quite go there with you. I'm not really ready for that. There's something inside me that's calling me a different way. And what you're saying is not agreeable to me. We're also free to cross boundaries, to move into places. On Sunday, I'll give the preview of the message that I'm preaching at First Congregational on Sunday. I'm fascinated that Jesus goes into the tax collector's house, that he goes to the house. He calls the man out of the tree and says, I'm going to your house. I'm going to stay with you. Crossing these boundaries. When we're able to challenge folks that try to control us, when we are able to cross boundaries, we are free to love. We're free to live at will. And that makes us not powerless. It actually makes us responsible. I hope you're sort of seeing the way this is all flowing together, right? So then the question is really, how does turning freedom from thinking like we're captives into becoming free, how could that change our perspective and the way that we think of the world and the way that we operate in the world? Have we experienced any of this during this time of being shut down? Have we discovered freedoms that we didn't know we had? Or have we had our freedoms challenged in ways that were surprising to us? And I'm opening it up now. I'm tired of talking. Any thoughts?
I think there's this is Tim, but this big connection between fear and freedom,
Mm-hmm.
right? So the fear kind of keeps us in bondage.
Yes.
And so when you're in that fear perspective, and when you're in that fear place, I think you're in that you're thinking about being free from something.
Mm-hmm.
But when you move past the fear, maybe you feel more courage to do things and freedom to do things.
Mm-hmm. Is fear so primal that we can't control it, or do we have a way of working our way out of it, I wonder?
Well, it's interesting comment, but I think the Buddha defines enlightenment as a state of no fear.
Mm-hmm.
So, and that's what John said as well, just a minute ago, right?
Yep. No fear in love, right?
Right. So that's the goal.
That's right. Anybody want to chime in on this? Any other thoughts?
Every time you keep saying love and fear, I've been reminded that I was told one time, the opposite of love is not hate. The opposite of love is fear.
Yes.
And that really applies to what's going on right now. All these people that it looks like they're hating, but I've heard so many places where it says it's fear.
They're fearing. They're afraid, right? Yes. Someone else had a comment?
It's me, Michelle.
Hey, Michelle.
What I thought about during this COVID, where we had the freedom to contribute to the greater good, that so many people took it negatively.
Mm-hmm.
Because they didn't have the freedom to move about.
Mm-hmm.
and responded to it as enslavement. Yes.
It is that. I mean, the masks is the big hot point, right? Or the social distancing, where it is this thing where folks are like, you're impinging on my freedom, as opposed to I am free to make the world healthier and safer and all of that, right?
Right.
Yeah. Anybody else?
Yeah.
Yes.
I know that there are 2 or 3 people who are familiar with kind of recovery movements, but it's one of the kind of things of the basis of most kind of recovery movements is developing an honest relationship with however you understand God to be, which is completely different from most of our experiences of how churches taught us to have a relationship with God.
Yes.
Because a lot of the kind of church view of teaching a relationship with God wasn't actually teaching a relationship. It was saying, this is what the relationship is.
Yes. Yes.
And way earlier when you kind of went, those of us who have exercised uncontrolled freedom, and again, anyone who's familiar with recovery programs, I had huge amounts of freedom, and every little bit of it.
Yeah.
But once you then start kind of trying to understand who you are and your relationship with God and the world around you, actually, that does come with a huge amount of fear attached to it as well. But in kind of working through that fear is where you kind of find that new freedom that exists in that as well.
Right. I think that's also where fear maybe, and back to Tim's point, right? Fear then kind of morphs into responsibility, right? So it's no longer am I afraid of it. I just know these are, but these are also the responsibilities and the definitions and the limits I place on myself, right? I think maybe the challenge that a lot of people have in religion, and here's the phrase that it always makes me a little crazy: organized religion, as opposed to disorganized religion. I'm kind of from the disorganized religion group. I like disorganized religion a little better, but it's like this idea of it becomes an issue of conformity, right? How are we going? We have all these people. We got to do something with them. We got to get them all in the room at the same time. We got to make them all sort of believe the same thing so that they can go out and tell what they believe, and it's a cohesive story. It's a marketing strategy. I mean, that's what I do elsewhere. It's a marketing strategy. What's the word? What's the slogan? Wow, I could have had a V8. Now we all know that's the message, okay? Now let's all live by that message. And even if I don't like V8, the word is, well, I could have had a V8. I guess I got to learn to like V8. And then people were wondering why their relationship with God is so shallow or non-existent, or they don't understand who they are fully. And here's the question that I want us to struggle with this week, is if we are not fully ourselves and aware of who we are and what that means, who are we in relationship with God, right? If I'm trying to be something I'm not, because that's what my religion expects of me, in my case, I will use the most obvious thing. I came from a faith that fully expected me. For some reason, they thought that there was 100% heterosexual birth rate. That's what our church believes, evidently, the church I grew up in. And so I was going to have to comply to this idea at the risk of marriage. It was fully expected. And I have still people who think I missed the boat when I didn't marry the girl that I was dating and drag her into a loveless marriage and put her through all kinds of things for the sake of conformity, right? Now, if I have to be all of that, how am I being honest with God and with myself and with everyone around me? And so when religion gets to the place where it is trying to tell you who you are and how to be and what to do, it's missing the boat, because it's absolutely neutralizing your ability to be in right relationship. So the freedom aspect, there are a lot of preachers that get nervous when you start talking about, and pastors get nervous, you start talking about freedom, because that means that I can't control everybody. But the problem with that is that you can't control anybody anyway. That's not what you're set up to do. You're not the thought police. You're a pastor. You know what? Shepherds get out in the field and the lambs go where they are, and the pastor just the shepherd just watches and says, be careful, there's a cliff over there. Let's kind of move you over here a little bit. But we get lost in this idea that religion means conformity, that it means loss of freedom, that it means that for me to be a good Christian, I've got to be a compliant Christian. To be a good Christian, you've got to be a you Christian. whatever that means. You've got to be a you Christian. And if that, whatever that means. So you may be the kind of Christian that prays morning, noon, and night. I want you to be that Christian. But you may also be the kind of Christian that meditates and just sits in stillness every now and then and is aware of God more than you are talking to God. Then I want you to be that kind of Christian. Because you're free. You're free to create and make meaning. You're free to love. You're free to doubt. And that's where all of your humanity comes into play. And when you are fully human and full grip of who you are, that's who interacts with God. That's who understands God. And I'm preaching. I should be quiet. But it is the truth of what we need to get. And so many of us have been in situations where we have been led to be less of ourselves in order to be more like Jesus. But at the end, Jesus was Jesus. And I'm Tim.
I'm going to chime in, and I apologize because I had to step out for a few minutes. So if you covered some of this, feel free to tell me to shut up. But you should always feel free to tell me to shut up. Freedom implies an immense amount of responsibility.
Yes.
Because if, the greater your freedom, the fewer the number of sort of preordained rules.
Mm-hmm.
And then you have to figure out the bases on which you live your life and on which you make your decisions. And in our culture, when you can go into a grocery store and have 36 options for what kind of ketchup to buy, our brains really can only handle so many decisions.
Mm-hmm.
And I think of the sorts of, making it all about me again, the sorts of decisions that my sister and my uncle have made within the space of 6 weeks.
Mm-hmm.
Those are the amazingly consequential decisions which hopefully by that point in your life you're not struggling with. Hopefully you've settled upon the principles on which you make decisions.
Mm-hmm.
But freedom implies an incredible degree of individual responsibility.
Exactly.
And I don't think that it's always good that so much responsibility be given to the individual. I think it's good that we have group discussions like this,
Mm-hmm.
because we shouldn't have to make decisions on what our principles are by ourselves.
I think you're right in that we need the information that we can gather from other folks. I totally agree. I think that I'm looking around at who's on this call. You don't know them as well as I do, Brian. There's so much wisdom on this call that we could just write the whole book right here. There's so much life experience and wisdom and spirituality and all of this beauty and people with a wide variety of beliefs. And so the more we draw that together and draw on one another, actually the freer we can become, right? Because we should nurture one another's freedoms. Michelle?
Can I say, well,
Unity helps.
I think when we talk about Christianity, I think we need to say American Christianity.
Yes.
Because the canopy that it sits under is the American idea of rugged individualism.
Yes. Yes.
That shapes and informs American Christianity. That is not true everywhere in the world.
You're right.
And like the philosophy of Ubuntu, I am because we are,
Yes. Yes.
implies a different type of freedom.
Yes. Yes.
That the saving grace is in the community. So I just want to lift that up, because that the idea of it's all about me and all about it's a very American capitalism driven.
Yes. What's the big question always in America? Do you know Jesus Christ as what? Your personal Savior.
Right.
Jesus the valet. Jesus is the one that answers my prayers and makes the green lights when I'm running late for work, turns the lights green, and Jesus the one that makes me get that good deal on the turkey at the grocery store. You know, that's Jesus, right? That's not at all the Christianity that we see in Paul in the early church. It's a community. It's a communal understanding, right? And that's why freedom is so essential. If you go back to what did Paul say? Make sure that you are free in Christ. Why? To serve one another, right? That's what it is. It's about the building one another. It's about doing what exactly, and Brian's right. It's about what we're doing here today in conversation, in community, holding one another up. Whoa. Okay. I'm looking at the time. I've talked a lot, but I hope that this is triggering some thoughts, because I want us, obviously, my goal is for us to grow in our faith and to grow in our experience and to grow in our understanding of ourselves and one another and who we are in relationship to one another, to those around us, certainly to our Maker, to our beliefs, how that guides us. And if we are not careful, we can fall very much into this sort of, into our own little faith bubbles, right? That's the American way. We're all in our own little faith bubbles, and if my bubble looks like your bubble, we can all bubble together. And you know, and that's the way. We'll all just go hang out in this bubble together. And that's not what this freedom is about. This freedom is about a depth and an understanding and an ability to reach and to hold up one another and to care for one another and to struggle. To struggle. Any final quick little thoughts before we go?
No, Tim, I have one.
Yes.
So it's kind of interesting how, religion can sometimes talk about, freedom to and freedom from things. Give us freedom to do things and freedom, and give us freedom to move away from things.
Yes.
But it's interesting because there's two examples with an animal. Many Christians know Francis of Assisi.
Mm-hmm.
And there was an old story where he was in a small town or a village, and I kid you not, I was in New Mexico, and I had never heard of Francis of Assisi before, and I kid you not, I went into this church and I saw this Christian monk next to a statue of a wolf. There was a statue of a Christian monk next to a wolf, and I was like, and because all I know about wolves and Christianity, I had no idea who Francis of Assisi was. I didn't know who was sort of the Wolf of Gubbio. All I knew is that wolves were seen as sort of creatures of the devil in Christianity.
Mm-hmm. Or in the culture, right? Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And so, I was told this story of this guy who literally befriended the wolf, and I was amazed how this Christian monk managed to interpret this wolf as not being a minion of the devil, and instead convinced the wolf to make peace with the people of this village.
Mm-hmm.
Back when he was alive, I was like, that is an amazing story. I mean, I realized that it wasn't really a true story, but that's an amazing story. And it kind of reminded me in a way of something else I heard of, how in Ethiopia, there's this city called Harar, and it's one of the holiest cities in Islam.
Yeah.
And the thing is, on the outskirts, there are two clans of spotted hyenas.
Mm.
And when they enter the city at night, barely anyone's. In fact, they're encouraged by the locals to come there. In fact, but it's because of a dark history. So there was, from what I can tell, remember some stories say there was a famine and the spotted hyenas came into the city and attacked the people. But the leaders of the city said that the only way to stop these attacks was to make peace with the animals.
Ah.
And so yeah, and nowadays they're often regarded as the people's protectors. In fact, there's actually been some cases where there might be wild predators that would come in, and the spotted honeycombs would just chase them off.
That's funny. In preacher circles, you know, we say to those kind of stories, that will preach. That will preach, because it is always about making meaning in relationship, right? It is about looking at situations that look to go one way, and you say, but wait a minute. I can hear I got a good buddy of mine on the South Side. If we'd been sitting here, we'd say, he just stopped you. Wait, stop, Tony. That will preach. So it's powerful, but it's also about the freedom to make meaning that transforms, right? It will transform situations. Thank you for that. We gotta move on.
All right.
But we're gonna leave those alone because we already answered them. Next week, speaking of hyenas, next week we're going to look at evil and how Scripture introduces the notion of evil and what evil means. And I'm just going to put a teaser out here. God is an active player in this story. So those of us that like the Hallmark God that does nothing good, God is an active player in this. So I'll let you wrestle with that. I have to make sure that, you know, we all begin to think about it's time for giving. You can give online at gatheraop@gmail. I always feel like I'm on the NPR station, like, okay, I've just heard a news story. Now we're going to talk for 15 minutes and tell you if you give now, we'll let you know. I wish if I had a hat to give you, send you all or something, or you can get tickets to something. I don't have that. We just have this. Quick Pay, Chase, or Zelle. Email your gifts to gatheraop@gmail. You all are so beautiful and do such a wonderful job supporting this ministry, and we really, really do appreciate it. So I want to thank you all and remind you, Sunday, 5 o'clock on the Gather Austin Oak Park website. I'll be sending out a link to that. I have to tell you, I'm just telling you, I've been looking at you all on video all week long and listening to you sing and do amazing things. It's going to be a great, great service. So join us, 45 minutes long. We will see you at 5 o'clock on Sunday in the name of love. It's all YouTube music, and it's going to be really, really good. Do you know what? Michelle, pray us out, please.
Oh, you didn't hear me. I said, what?
What? I know you've been on Zooms and YouTubes and in class all day long. But we'll let you have the last word. Pray us out.
Let us just take a deep breath. And let us just think about the conversation we've just had. And Holy One, we come before you in this moment, thankful for the freedom to gather even cyberly.
Yes.
We thank you for each and every person here. We thank you for every perspective shared. We thank you that we are able to create a community that listens deeply, even in this time of separation and turmoil. So Lord, please be with us as we leave this sacred space and return to our routines. Bless this wonderful pastor. Bless each and every person here. Let all the gathered people of Gather say amen.
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 Amen. Thank you
Amen.
all.